The stew was thick with salt pork and winter roots, steam rising like a prayer into the iron-gray air of Providence Gulch. Abel ate slowly, hunched over the rough-hewn table outside the tavern, the only place a man of his size and silence was left to his own devices. The cold bit at the edges of his world, a familiar companion that seeped through his buckskin jacket and settled deep in his bones. His beard, long and tangled with frost, caught the scent of the food. He was a mountain of a man, built of the same hard rock and timber as the peaks that loomed over the town, and he moved with a deliberate economy that wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word. The clatter from inside the tavern was a distant language, full of brittle laughter and suspicion he had no use for. He preferred the quiet complaint of the wind in the pines and the solid weight of the spoon in his hand. Then a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, too slight for the wind. Two figures, identical as split pine, materialized from the twilight. They were thin, their forms lost in tattered gray garments that offered no real defense against the encroaching night. The dresses, he'd later learn they were called Chong Sam's, were silk once, but now they were just the memory of it, frayed at the collar and hem, the color of ash. They stopped a respectful distance from his table, their hands clasped before them, heads slightly bowed. They didn't look like they belonged to this world of mud and snow and hard men. They looked like porcelain figures left out in a storm. One of them, her voice no louder than the scuff of a dry leaf, spoke. The words were careful, shaped with an accent that was foreign and clean. "Sir, may we have your leftovers?" Abel paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. Beggars were common enough, drifters and failed prospectors with hollow eyes and hands that shook. He usually ignored them. It was a hard country, and a man looked after his own. Pity was a currency he did not trade in. He was about to grunt a dismissal, a sound that would send them scurrying back into the shadows they came from, but then he lifted his head and saw their eyes. They were identical, dark and deep and utterly exhausted. But beneath the weariness was a hard, polished core of endurance that refused to be ground down. There was no servility in their gaze, no practiced pleading. There was only a profound, devastating quiet. It was the quiet of people who had lost everything but the small, fierce flame of their own dignity. It was a look that didn't ask for mercy, but simply stated the facts of their existence. Hunger was a fact. Cold was a fact. Their survival, hanging by a thread, was a fact. And in those twin gazes, so alike, yet each holding its own specific sorrow, Abel saw something of his own buried grief. The stillness in them mirrored the stillness in him. It was this that broke him. The spoon lowered back to the bowl with a soft clink. He looked from one face to the other, seeing the faint blue tinge of cold on their lips, the way they held themselves rigid to keep from shivering. He pushed the heavy wooden bowl across the table toward them. "Take it," he said. The words were gravelly from disuse. He also pushed his block of cornbread forward. All of it. The two women looked at the bowl, then at each other, a silent conversation passing between them in a single glance. The one who had spoken gave a short, formal bow. The other mirrored the gesture. They did not fall upon the food like starving animals. Instead, one of them produced 2 sets of small, worn chopsticks from a sleeve, and they began to eat with a slow, deliberate grace that was both heartbreaking and magnificent. They shared the stew, each taking a piece of root or pork, then waiting for the other. It was a ceremony of survival, performed in the falling snow under the hostile yellow light of the tavern window. From inside, Abel could feel the eyes of the townsfolk. He heard a muffled laugh. Sheriff Brody stepped out onto the porch, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, his gaze hard and assessing. "Abel," Brody said, his voice carrying an official weight, "you know there ain't no room for their kind here. The railroad work is done. They're supposed to be gone." Abel didn't look at the sheriff. He watched the women, Lynn and Sue, as he would later learn their names were. He watched the careful way they cleaned the bowl, leaving not a single drop. When they were finished, they stood. The first one, Lynn, looked at him. "Thank you, sir," she said. Her sister, Sue, echoed the sentiment with a nod, her eyes still wary. They were about to turn and melt back into the darkness. He imagined them finding some alley, some collapsed lean-to, where the wind would surely find them before morning. He thought of the quiet dignity in their eyes, and the hollow space inside his own chest ached. It was a foolish, impractical impulse. It was the kind of thing that invited trouble, the kind of trouble he had spent years avoiding. He stood up, his great size seeming to swallow the light around him. "Wait," he commanded. The single word stopped them. They turned, their expressions unreadable but for the tension in their shoulders. He looked past them, at the smug face of the sheriff, at the curious faces pressed against the tavern glass. He felt a stubborn, unfamiliar anger rise in him. It wasn't pity. It was something harder. It was defiance. "My cabin," he said, the words coming out clipped and rough. "It's warm. You can stay the night. Just the night." The walk to his cabin was a silent affair, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of his heavy boots in the snow and the lighter, more desperate whisper of their thin slippers. The lantern he carried cut a small, trembling circle of gold in an overwhelming darkness, catching the glitter of ice on bare alder branches and the smooth, sculpted drifts of white. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked them through the trees. He walked ahead, breaking the trail, his broad back a shield against the wind. He didn't look back, but he could hear them, their breathing shallow and quick. He could feel their weariness, as if it were his own. His cabin was set deep in the woods, a good mile from the sour judgment of the town. It was small, built by his own hands from logs he had felled and shaped himself. It was a fortress of solitude, and he was now leading strangers to its door. When they arrived, smoke was still curling from the stone chimney, a faint gray plume against the black sky. He pushed the heavy door open, revealing a single room bathed in the soft, flickering light of the banked embers in the hearth. The air inside was warm and smelled of pine smoke, coffee, and drying wool. It was a simple space, dominated by the stone fireplace, a sturdy bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center. Everything was meticulously clean, obsessively ordered. It was the home of a man who fought chaos by controlling his small patch of the world. The sisters, Lynn and Sue, hesitated on the threshold, as if an invisible line prevented them from entering. They looked from the warmth within to the crushing cold without, their faces etched with a mixture of longing and deep-seated caution. Abel understood. A man like him, in a place like this, offering shelter, it was not an act that came without a price in their world. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway clear. "The floor by the fire is warm," he said, his voice gruff. "I've got blankets." He gestured with his head toward a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He didn't offer help. He offered space. He moved to the hearth, stoked the embers back to life with a poker, and laid another log on the grate. Sparks danced up the chimney. He did not watch them, giving them the privacy of his back. He heard the soft shuffle as they finally stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with them. The door closed with a solid thud, shutting out the night and the town and the world that had cast them out. He took 2 thick wool blankets from the chest and laid them on the floorboards near the fire, a good distance from his own bed. He filled a tin cup with water from a bucket by the door and set it on the table. He did not speak again. He retreated to his side of the room, sat on the edge of his bed, and began the slow, methodical process of removing his boots. It was a routine, a ritual, and its familiarity was a comfort. He could feel their eyes on him, tracking his every move. When he was done, he lay down on his bed, still fully clothed, and turned his face to the wall. He was intensely aware of them, of the soft rustle of their thin clothing, the almost inaudible murmur of their voices as they spoke to each other in a language he didn't understand. He heard them settle onto the blankets. Then there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the wind moaning around the eaves of the cabin. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the quiet rhythm of their breathing, a foreign sound in the profound solitude of his life. It was a sound that was already changing the shape of the silence. The next morning, Abel rose before dawn, as was his habit. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the room was filled with a gray, pre-dawn chill. He moved quietly, his large frame surprisingly light on the floorboards. The two sisters were still asleep by the hearth, huddled together under the blankets for warmth. In the faint light, their faces looked younger, the harsh lines of exhaustion softened. They were just girls, he realized, barely women. He added wood to the fire, his movements precise and silent. He put a pot of coffee on to boil and sliced thick pieces of bacon into a cast-iron skillet. The smell of it sizzling soon filled the cabin. He was turning the bacon when a soft sound made him look over. Lynn was awake, sitting up and watching him. Her eyes were clear and direct. Sue stirred beside her, awakened by the scent of food. "We must earn this," Lynn said. It wasn't a question. Abel grunted, not looking at her. "I said one night." "We will work," she insisted, her voice quiet but firm. "We do not take charity." She nudged her sister and they both stood, folding the blankets with a neat precision that spoke of long discipline. He saw then that the gray silk of their dresses was not just worn but meticulously mended in a dozen places. The stitches were tiny and perfect, a map of their resilience. Sue, the quieter of the two, went to the water bucket, found a rag, and began to wipe down the surface of the small table without being asked. Lynn picked up his worn buckskin jacket, which he'd left slung over a chair. She examined a tear in the sleeve, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I can mend this," she said, looking at him for permission. Abel found himself at a loss. His life was a closed loop of solitary tasks. He chopped wood, he hunted, he repaired his own gear, he cooked his own meals. The idea of someone else touching his things, entering his routines, was deeply unsettling. But the determined set of her jaw, the pride that radiated from her small frame, was impossible to deny. It was the same dignity he had seen in her eyes the night before. To refuse would be to insult it. "There's a sewing kit," he mumbled, gesturing toward a small wooden box on a shelf. "In the tin." He dished out the bacon and fried some eggs, placing 2 plates on the now clean table. They ate in silence, the same way they had eaten the stew, slowly, with purpose. When they were done, they washed the plates and the skillet in a basin of hot water from the hearth, their movements synchronized and efficient. While Sue swept the floor with a crude broom, Lynn sat by the fire, the buckskin jacket in her lap. With thread from his kit, she began to stitch the tear. Her fingers were nimble, her work swift and exact. The seam she created was stronger and neater than any repair he had ever made himself. He sat and watched her, pretending to sharpen a skinning knife, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the crackle of the fire and the whisper of her needle through the thick hide. He watched her slender hands, chapped and red from the cold, working with such focused grace. There was a story in those hands, a story of hardship and skill. He wondered briefly about their past, how 2 girls like them ended up alone and starving in Providence Gulch. He knew it had to do with the railroad, the great iron snake that had carved its way through the mountains, using up men and spitting them out. He'd heard the stories of the Chinese laborers, brought in by the hundreds, treated like cattle, and then abandoned when the work was done. That afternoon he went out to check his trap lines. He hesitated at the door, an unfamiliar reluctance holding him back. Leaving them alone in his cabin felt like a risk, a violation of his own fiercely guarded solitude. "I'll be back before dark," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Lynn simply nodded, her eyes not leaving her work. When he returned, the scent of wood smoke and something else, something clean and herbal, met him at the door. The cabin was transformed. The floors were scrubbed, his spare set of clothes were washed and hanging near the fire to dry, and the single window was wiped clean, letting in the last of the pale winter light. A pot of thin soup, made from the last of his root vegetables, simmered on the hearth. Sue was humming softly, a tune he'd never heard, as she organized his scattered collection of tools on the shelf. Lynn was still sewing, having moved on from his jacket to one of his shirts, reinforcing a frayed collar. They had taken his silence as permission and had set about turning his rough shelter into a place of order and quiet industry. They had worked to earn their keep, and in doing so, they had laid a gentle claim to the space. He stood in the doorway, the cold air swirling around him, and felt a crack appear in the frozen wall around his heart. For the first time in years, the cabin felt less like a refuge from the world and more like a home. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their life in the small cabin settled into a quiet routine. The one night he had offered stretched into 2, then a week, then an unspoken agreement. Abel would hunt and chop wood, his days spent in the vast, silent wilderness. Lynn and Sue would tend to the cabin, their presence a soft, steady hum of activity that greeted him each evening. They mended all his clothes, cooked his meals, and kept the small space with a fierce, protective cleanliness. They were tireless workers, their pride a shield against the implied charity of their situation. Abel, in turn, began to provide for them without comment. He started buying extra flour and salt when he went to town, leaving the parcels on the table without a word. He traded a prime pelt for 2 pairs of sturdy leather boots and left them by the hearth one morning before they woke. He never saw them try the boots on, but the next time he saw them go outside to fetch water, their thin slippers were gone, replaced by the warm, practical leather. His trips to Providence Gulch became tense affairs. The town had noticed. Whispers followed him down the muddy main street. "Keeps them Chinaman women up there," he heard one man mutter at the general store. "Ain't right." The store owner, a man named Henderson, who had known Abel for years, looked at him with a new, unwelcome curiosity. "Be careful, Abel," he'd said, weighing out a bag of beans. "Folks are getting riled. Sheriff's been asked to look into it. Vagrancy laws, you know." Abel had just stared at him until Henderson dropped his gaze. He paid for his goods and left, the weight of the town's judgment a heavy cloak on his shoulders. He was an outsider by nature, but this was different. He was now a pariah by choice. The town's animosity only hardened his resolve. The cabin was his land, his home. What he did there was his business. The quiet warmth within those 4 walls became a sanctuary against the cold hostility without. He found himself talking more, not in long conversations, but in short, practical exchanges that slowly bridged the silence. He would point to a bird and name it. "Whiskey Jack." Lynn would watch it, then say its name in her own language, the sound like soft bells. He learned that Lynn was the elder by a few minutes, the more outspoken and pragmatic one. Sue was quieter, more artistic, her hands skilled not just at mending, but at finding beauty in small things. One day he came home to find she had woven a small, intricate knot from a piece of scrap twine and hung it from a nail on the wall. It was a simple, beautiful object that served no purpose except to exist. It was the first purely decorative thing his cabin had ever held. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the door and piling snow against the window, Sue was seized by a fit of coughing. It was a deep, racking sound that shook her thin frame. By the next morning she was burning with fever. Her breath came in shallow rasps, and she was too weak to stand. Lynn tended to her with a desperate, focused calm, wiping her brow with a cool cloth and trying to get her to drink water. But the fever climbed. Abel watched. his sense of helplessness a cold knot in his stomach. He was a man of the wilderness. He knew how to set a bone, stitch a wound, and identify edible plants. But this was an enemy within, a sickness that was beyond his rough skills. "She needs a doctor," Lynn said, her voice tight with fear. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that struck him to the core. She looked at him, her dark eyes pleading. "The town—" He knew what she was asking. To bring the doctor from Providence Gulch up here would be to invite the entire town into their lives. It would bring the sheriff, the laws, the prejudice, right to their door. But looking at Sue, pale and shivering under a pile of blankets, her life flickering like a guttering candle, there was no choice. "I'll go," he said. He wrapped himself in his heaviest furs and stepped out into the teeth of the storm. The wind tore at him, and the snow was so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. The mile to town was a brutal fight against the elements. When he finally stumbled into the doctor's office, covered in snow and ice, Dr. Miller, a weary man with kind eyes, looked up in surprise. "Abel, what in God's name?" "It's one of the women," Abel said, his voice raw. "Fever. Bad." Miller's face clouded with a mixture of professional concern and civic weariness. "The Chinese girls? Abel, you know the trouble this is causing." "Are you a doctor or the town gossip?" Abel's voice was a low growl. "She's dying." The doctor sighed, the sound of a man caught between his duty and his neighbors. He packed his bag. "I'll come, but this will have consequences, son. You know it will." The journey back was even worse, but Miller was a tough, older man, and they made it. When they entered the cabin, Lynn looked up, her face a mask of relief and fear. Miller was gentle with Sue, his examination swift and efficient. "Lung fever," he announced grimly. "Bad case. The cold and the hunger, it settled in her chest." He administered a tincture and left powders to be mixed with water. "Keep her warm. Keep the fluids in her. The rest is up to her and the Lord." As he was leaving, he placed a hand on Abel's arm. "Sheriff Brody will hear of this by morning. Be ready." For the next 2 days and nights, Abel and Lynn kept a constant vigil. They took turns bathing Sue's face, forcing sips of the medicated water between her cracked lips, and keeping the fire roaring. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside the small cabin. In the long, quiet hours of the night, with only the sound of the wind and Sue's labored breathing, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They moved around each other in a seamless, silent dance of shared purpose. He would bring her a cup of hot coffee. She would place a hand on his arm to stop him when he was about to add another log to the already blazing fire. They were a team, bound by a shared, desperate hope. One evening, while he was watching Sue sleep, Lynn came and sat near him on the floor. She was exhausted, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. "Her name, Sue, means simple, plain," she said softly. "Mine, Lynn, means forest." She looked at the log walls of the cabin. "It is fitting, I think." It was the first time she had offered anything personal about their past. He didn't push, but sat in the companionable silence, waiting. "Our parents were scholars," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "They came to build a life. But this country, it is not kind. They died of sickness at the railroad camp last year. We were left with their contract. We worked until the line was finished. Then they told us to go." She said it all without a trace of self-pity, a simple recitation of facts. He finally understood the source of the profound stillness he had seen in her eyes. It was the quiet of someone who had weathered an unimaginable storm and was still standing. He felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness, so fierce it almost choked him. He looked from Sue's sleeping face to Lynn's tired, determined one. "This is your home," he said. The words were quiet, but they had the weight of an oath. "As long as you want it." Lynn looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. For the first time he saw something other than gratitude or weariness in them. It was a flicker of warmth, a shy, questioning light. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. In that moment, the storm outside seemed to recede, and the only thing that mattered was the fragile peace within the four walls of the cabin, a peace they had built together, a peace he would defend with his life. The morning the sheriff came, the storm had broken. The world outside was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white, the sky a brilliant, painful blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. Sue's fever had finally broken in the night. She was sleeping peacefully, her breathing slow and even. A fragile quiet had settled over the cabin, the quiet of a battle won. Abel was splitting kindling outside when he saw the two figures on horseback making their way up the trail he had cleared. Sheriff Brody and his deputy, a young, nervous man named Peters. Abel didn't stop his work. He continued to swing the axe with a steady, powerful rhythm, the sharp crack of splitting wood the only sound in the frozen air. He was calm. The doctor's warning had prepared him. The vigil over Sue had forged something in him, something hard and clear. He knew what he had to do. Brody and Peters dismounted, their boots crunching in the snow. The sheriff's face was set in lines of grim duty. "Abel," he said, his voice flat, "we need to talk." "I'm listening," Abel replied, sinking the axe into the chopping block and turning to face them. He didn't invite them in. He stood before his door like a sentinel. "Doc Miller filed a report," Brody said, getting straight to the point. "He treated a Chinese woman here, an unregistered transient. By law, I'm supposed to escort them out of the county. For their own safety, of course." The last words were laced with a weary irony. "She was sick," Abel said. "Dying. Now she's not. She's not going anywhere." "It ain't your decision, Abel," the sheriff sighed. "There are rules. The town council is in an uproar. They see this as a threat. They're worried it'll encourage others." "A threat?" Abel's voice was dangerously low. "Two women, with nothing but the clothes on their backs? Who are they threatening?" The door of the cabin opened. Lynn stepped out, closing it softly behind her. She was wearing one of Abel's flannel shirts, which was far too big for her, but she had belted it at the waist and rolled up the sleeves. She looked small and frail next to the three men, but she stood tall, her back straight. She faced the sheriff without fear. "We are not transients, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the still air. "We had a contract with the railroad. We worked it until it was done. We are owed wages they never paid. We are not vagrants. We are creditors." Brody looked taken aback, both by her sudden appearance and the articulate dignity of her speech. "Ma'am, that's a matter for the company courts." "A court that will not see us," Lynn interrupted, her voice still level. "We came to this town because it was the nearest place to find shelter. We asked for nothing but to work. We were met with stones and insults. Mr. Abel gave us shelter when we would have frozen to death. We have earned our keep here. We have harmed no one." Abel watched her, a fierce pride swelling in his chest. She was not pleading for mercy. She was stating her case, claiming her right to exist, to be treated with decency. She was a forest, just as her name suggested, slender but with roots that ran deep and would not be moved. "The law is the law," Brody said, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. He looked from Lynn's defiant face to Abel's stony expression. He looked at the neat pile of firewood, the clean-swept path to the door, the wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. This was not the den of iniquity the town gossips had painted. This was a home. "Then the law is an ass," Abel said quietly. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Lynn. It was a simple, protective gesture, but it was absolute. "These women are under my protection. This is my property. If you mean to take them, you'll have to come through me." The deputy, Peters, shifted his weight nervously, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. But Sheriff Brody held up a hand. He was a man who enforced the town's laws, but he was not an unjust man. He looked at Abel's face, a face he had known for years, and saw a line drawn in the snow. He saw the quiet, unbreakable strength in the woman standing behind him. He saw the truth of the situation, and it shamed the petty fears of the town he represented. He let out a long, slow breath, his words turning to steam in the cold. "There's a provision," he said, thinking aloud, "for household servants, hired help. If they were officially in your employ, their residency would be legal." He looked directly at Abel. "Are they in your employ, Abel?" It was an offer, a way out, a legal fiction to satisfy the town council and end the confrontation. Abel looked at Lynn. Her eyes met his, and in that shared glance an entire conversation took place. He saw her pride, her fierce independence. She would never accept being called a servant. He turned back to the sheriff. "No," he said, the word clear and final. "They are not my servants." He paused, then said the words that would change everything. "They are my family." The declaration hung in the frozen air, stunning all three of them into silence. Family. It was a word he hadn't used in a decade, a word he thought he had buried for good. By saying it aloud, he had given it life again. He had formalized their bond, transforming their status from rescued strangers to rightful residents. He had claimed them, and in doing so, had reclaimed a part of himself. Sheriff Brody stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then a slow nod. He had seen enough. He had pushed as far as he would, or could. "All right, Abel," he said, his tone weary but resolute. "You tell anyone who asks. You tell them Sheriff Brody came up, investigated, and found the situation to be a private, domestic matter." He turned to his deputy. "Let's go, Peters." Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode away, their dark shapes shrinking against the vast, sunlit snow. Abel stood watching them go, not moving until they had disappeared into the trees. He felt Lynn's presence beside him. He turned to look at her. Her face was tilted up toward his, her eyes shining with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was gratitude, yes, but it was deeper than that. It was trust, absolute and unconditional. "Thank you," she whispered. "Go inside," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's cold. See to your sister." She nodded and slipped back into the warmth of the cabin. Abel remained outside for a few moments more, breathing in the clean, sharp air. He felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying. The silence of the mountains no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like peace. He had drawn a line not just against the town, but against his own past, his own isolation. He picked up the axe, his hand closing around the smooth, familiar wood of the handle. He had a family to keep warm. He had work to do. The days that followed the sheriff's visit were quiet and filled with a new kind of light. The town's hostility did not vanish, but it retreated to the level of muttered asides and sour looks, a harmless tide lapping against the rock of the sheriff's official declaration. The cabin became their entire world, a haven sealed by snow and mutual reliance. Sue recovered quickly, her natural resilience buoyed by the warmth and steady meals. Soon her soft humming once again filled the small room as she worked, a gentle soundtrack to their shared life. The unspoken romance that had been kindled during the desperate hours of Sue's illness began to grow in the calm that followed. It was a thing of quiet gestures, not grand declarations. It was in the way Abel would leave a rare winter wildflower he'd found on the table for Lynn, and the way she would save him the best piece of meat from the stew. It was in the shared glances across the flickering firelight, glances that held a universe of understanding. He learned the rhythm of her breathing, the cadence of her quiet speech. She learned the meaning of his silences, understanding that his lack of words was not a lack of feeling. One evening, he was working on a broken harness strap, his large hands, usually so deft, struggling with the small, intricate buckle. The leather was stiff and the light was poor. Lynn came over from the hearth, holding a candle closer. "Allow me," she said softly. She took the strap from him, her small, nimble fingers working the buckle with a practiced ease. Her head was bent in concentration, and a loose strand of her dark hair fell across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear. His calloused fingers brushed the soft skin of her temple. It was the slightest of touches, but it felt like a bolt of lightning in the quiet room. She froze, her hands stilling on the leather. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide, searching his. In their dark depths, he saw his own reflection, and something more, a reflection of the same deep, unspoken affection he felt for her. The air grew thick with everything they had never said. He didn't pull his hand away, but let it rest for a moment against her hair. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a question and an answer all in one. She leaned into his touch, just for a second, a small, trusting movement that made his heart ache. Then she straightened and finished her work on the harness, her movements just as precise as before, but with a new, subtle awareness in them. She handed it back to him. "It is fixed," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Thank you, Lynn," he said, his voice low. He called her by her name, and the simple act felt deeply intimate. From that day on, the space between them was charged with a gentle, certain warmth. The cabin, once his fortress of solitude, was now a shared sanctuary. The winter that he had always seen as a time of burial and endurance was transforming before his eyes. The snow was no longer a wall that kept the world out, but a soft blanket that kept them safe within. As the first signs of the thaw began to appear, with water dripping from the eaves and the stark white of the landscape softening at the edges, the future felt not like a threat, but like a promise. One afternoon, Abel came inside to find Lynn and Sue looking out the clean window, a patch of bare earth visible where the sun had melted the snow. "Spring is coming," Sue said, her voice full of a simple, wondrous joy. Abel came to stand behind them. He looked over their heads, out at the changing world. He had faced down the town, a lung fever, and the ghosts of his own past. He had not done it alone. He felt a hand slip into his. It was Lynn's. Her fingers were small but strong, and they laced through his own as if they had always belonged there. He squeezed her hand gently. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. He looked out at the melting snow and the promise of new life. The winter was ending, but for him, in this small cabin in the woods, with these two women who had become his family, his heart, life was just beginning.